Great. Okay, so helo bawb, a croeso i'r webinar. So da ni'n edrych ar sut i adnabod cacwn a gwenyn ar ei gefndir, yn ogystal i edrych ar rhai o'r pethau sy'n ni fel ffermwyr ei gwneud yn ei lles. Rhys Evans dwi, a dwi'n gweithio i'r rhwydwaith ffermio lles natur yng Nghymru. A rhwydwaith o ffermwyr ydyn ni sy'n frwdfrydig dros ffermio sy'n gydnaws o bywyd gwyllt ar amgylchedd ac yn ngerddol dros hybu bioamrywiaeth a cael amgylchedd gref ar ein ffermdir. So welcome everyone to tonight's webinar. We'll be looking at how to identify bumblebees as well as exploring some farming practices that can help boost their numbers and kind of wider pollinators in general. I'm Rhys Evans and I work for the Nature Friendly Farming Network in Wales. We're a network of farmers that have come together to champion a way of farming that is sustainable and good for nature. And I'm delighted to be joined by Claire and Anna from Bumblebee Conservation Trust, as well as Stuart Taylor, who's a dairy farmer at Argoed Farm near Mold in North East Wales. So just to go over the running order, Claire will kick things off, talking about sort of bumblebee ecology and how to ID some of the most common species that you're likely to find on your farms. So that will take around 20 minutes or so. And then Anna will talk about some of the land management techniques that farmers can implement to increase pollinator populations. And we'll hear from Stuart about some of the great things that's going on at Argoed Farm as well. So that will last around half an hour or so. And then we'll take some questions at the end. So as I mentioned earlier, please use the chat function to ask questions, or alternatively at the end you can use the raise hand function to ask a question verbally. And just a reminder as well, there will be a follow-up session in a week's time on Wednesday the 9th of March at 6 p.m, which will take a more in-depth look at Bumblebee ID, as well as how to monitor and record them on your farm. But for tonight, we'll keep things a bit simpler. This webinar is likely to last for about an hour or so, but it might run over, but that's not the end of the world. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Claire. So the floor is yours, Claire.
Okay, thank you, Rhys. That's brilliant. Just bear with me a sec, folks. I'll just do the old screen share. Always panic slightly at this point. Rhys, is that okay? Brilliant. Okay. Well, yeah, hi, everyone. Really, really pleased to be here. My name's Claire, obviously, and I'm the project officer for the Bumblebee Conservation Trust's Skills for Bees Cymru project. I've worked for the trust on and off for quite a few years now, and I have to say a lot of my work has been with individuals that are interested in bumblebees and with communities. So I'm really, really delighted to actually have this opportunity to join with my colleague Anna and present to you this evening as landowners and farmers, because conservation of bumblebees in our wider landscape is just so important. So I'm really pleased to be here. My project, Skills for Bees Cymru, is a 3-year project which started last year and runs till 2024. And it is primarily, or entirely, to do with teaching people to identify bumblebees and to record and monitor them. So it's very much, Stuart, there's still a few people coming in actually. Rhys, sorry, Rhys, if you could, Brill, thank you. Sorry, folks. So yeah, it's all about identification and monitoring, which is a critical part of conservation, because at the bottom line is, you know, if we don't know what we have and where it is, then we can't take measures to conserve it. There are quite big gaps in data, in our bumblebee data, both geographically across Wales and in terms of individual species information. So my project is aimed at filling those gaps, and I love it. It's a really brilliant job, and it's a really great project. So Reese did just say we would do some ID tonight. We're not really going to do any ID tonight because ID is quite involved, and in 20 minutes what I'm going to do is just introduce you to bumblebees. If you're already quite knowledgeable, I apologise, but hopefully you'll enjoy some of the pictures and information, and then next week we'll pick up then on the ID. So that's a little bit of background. So if we go right back to bees in the UK generally, we have around about 280 species, which is obviously quite a lot. And of those, we have one species of honeybee. So all of the honeybees we have in the UK are Apis mellifera. I'm sure some of you might be beekeepers or know beekeepers. And there are different strains of that species. So we get the different colour forms, etc., and regional specialisms, if you like, that have sort of grown up over many, many years of breeding. But it is actually just one species, and that's the only species that gives us honey. Okay, when I do this sort of work with some groups, particularly school groups, I cannot get that that fact into them that only honeybees make honey, because obviously for most people that relationship is very much fixed in their mind. So the vast majority of our bee species are actually solitary bees, and whereas honeybees are social insects, as you know, that live in a colony with a queen and her female workers, and very much work for the benefit of the colony, solitary bees, as their name suggests, don't live in colonies, although they'll often nest very close to each other in very big aggregations. But essentially, with solitary bee species, the females work alone, and they make up the biggest diversity of our bee fauna, and indeed in the UK, in Europe and the whole world. But they're often overlooked and not known about because they tend to be smaller and less conspicuous than bumblebees and honeybees. But solitary bees are incredibly important pollinators, and they're absolutely fascinating as well. Many different types and forms to discover in that group. Okay, so on to our bumblebees. We've got 24 species in the UK. We've got 18 social species. So bumblebees, the majority of them are similar to honeybees in that they are social insects. They've evolved a social lifestyle, if you like, where you have a queen in a nest or colony with her daughter workers. Bumblebees have much, much smaller colonies than honeybees. So a typical honeybee colony might have tens of thousands of workers. Bumblebee colonies might be between about 50 and 200, depending on the species. So much lower numbers for an individual queen to produce. We have 6 what we call cuckoo species, which I'll go into a little bit more next week when we do the ID. But basically they have evolved a sneaky little lifestyle where they just have males and females, and the females will invade the nests of social bumblebees and take over, just like a cuckoo bird does. She'll often kill the social bumblebee queen or expel her from the nest, banish her from the nest, and use her workers to bring up her own young. They always exist in perfect balance with the social species. So sometimes, you know, people think, well, cuckoo bumblebees, that's bad, but they're actually also really good pollinators, and they always exist in lower numbers than their hosts. So it's a balanced interaction, as most of nature is. So most of our bumblebee species, well, all of our bumblebee species are native, and almost all of our colonies are wild, unlike honeybees. But we do import buff-tailed bumblebee colonies for soft fruit pollination, which I'll come to in a little bit more detail in a bit. This has implications for conservation because, I can never remember where the factory is. It's either in Netherlands or Belgium, Holland or Belgium. There's a massive bumblebee factory where they produce thousands and thousands and thousands of buff-tailed bumblebee colonies, and they export them all over the world. This has had massive implications in some countries where they're not native. For us, the implications are more subtle, but it is actually a different sort of strain of the buff-tailed bumblebee. So there is work being done on the impacts of this, and farmers actually use them in greenhouses. And I don't know, I'm not an expert on this at all, but as I understand it, they're supposed to destroy the colonies once their job is done, but obviously often they don't, and they escape and off into the wild they go. So we do use captive bred bumblebees to in agricultural production in this country. Okay, so this is my like party line when I go to parties, which is actually never, but yeah, bumblebees don't die when they sting you. Okay, it is a myth. Because they have a beautifully smooth sting, and I've seen those stings several times, felt it only once in the last few years. Honeybees have a barbed sting, a bit like an arrow. So when a honeybee female stings you, her sting goes into your skin, and she often can't pull it out again. It gets stuck on the barbs, and as she pulls away, it'll fatally injure her. It'll sort of pull her insides. With a bumblebee, that's not the case, so she can sting and sting and sting again. They don't tend to be aggressive at all. Obviously, they can sting and they would defend their nest, but they're not aggressive insects. And it's only the females that sting. Okay, no male bees have a sting, whether it's honeybees, solitary bees or bumblebees. No male wasps have a sting, and it is because basically, apologies to all the men, I'm not being sexist, but a Bumblebee Society is a matriarchal, female dominant, female powerful society. The queens and the workers, the queens lay the eggs, she builds the initial nest, the workers tend the young, they clean the nest, they defend the nest from predators, they kind of do everything. Okay, and yeah, it always gets a laugh because the males literally are there for one reason, and they sit about sipping nectar until that reason might present itself in the form of a queen. So yeah, their sting has evolved from they've evolved from wasps. Bees have evolved from wasps, and their sting has evolved from an egg-laying tube. So the males don't even have the equipment. Okay, it's evolved from the female reproductive equipment, if you like. So smooth sting, lovely curved smooth sting. And bumblebees are what we call, posh word is, they are called biculate, meaning they have pollen baskets. So what this means in simple terms, basically all it means is their hind leg, the middle section, a tibia. If you can see on this beautiful buff-tailed queen, she has a very shiny triangular tibia there. So tibular, I should say, not tibia. And so on the edges, there are thick, stiff hairs, which form a sort of basket, but the out-facing surface is perfectly smooth and shiny. And that's where she collects the pollen, she combs it off her hairs with her back legs, and she will mix it with nectar, regurgitated nectar, and stick it in a nice pollen lump. And I'm sure you've seen honeybees and bumblebees with those big yellow pollen lumps on their back legs. Again, only the females have the equipment to do that, and the wherewithal to do it, and the intention and behaviour to do it. The males will inadvertently get themselves covered in pollen, but they won't comb it back and form this lovely pollen lump, which is then taken back to the nest. And basically they do this to feed the young, because pollen is super nutritious. And as I just said, bees evolved from wasps. Wasps are not vegetarian. They collect, they feed their young other insects, sort of insect meat, if you like. And as wasps evolved into bees, those bees evolved to replace that insect prey for their young with collecting pollen, because pollen is just so nutritious. And so you can think of a bee almost as a vegetarian wasp. And of course, bumblebees are super efficient at this, which I'll go into in a bit more detail. So that's the basics of bumblebees. And I should say as well that of the 18 social species, only 8 of those are common and widespread in UK and also in Wales. The queens hibernate alone. So with honeybees, because they make honey for the colony, that is an adaptation, if you like, to surviving a temperate winter. With bumblebees, they don't make honey. There is a small form of honey, sort of honey that they do produce, but it's nothing like the honey that we know. And those, to survive the winter, basically, the colony dies off and the queens hibernate alone, which is obviously very, very different from honeybees. So why the fuss about bumbles? Well, there's lots of reasons. You can ask a child, they'll say honey, you know, they don't make honey, but the association with bees is so strong in that it's part of why they are in the forefront of media and public and research attention these days. It's the sound of summer. People find nests, so they're very aware of bumblebees. Bumblebees are characterful, they're beautiful. There's lots of cultural references to bumblebees, and of course they sting. You ask any kid and they'll have a sting story, you know, as do most adults. So, you know, there's lots of reasons in the public mind of why these guys are important. And from, you know, a conservation point of view, if we're getting more to the nitty gritty, obviously Anna and I talked about this today, Anna, and I just made a note of what we said. There's the intrinsic value of these species, which is hugely important. Pollination, which I'll talk about a bit more in a sec, of both wild plants and crop plants. They are key to that. They underpin food chains through the process of pollination and maintaining diversity in the landscape, and also they provide food for predators as well. And they're in our sort of consciousness because they have suffered such massive declines in recent years. Reese, don't let me waffle on for too long, okay? Because I know we're on a bit of a tight schedule. People know, whenever people ask me what I do for a job and I tell them, they say to me straight away, oh my God, bees are in trouble, aren't they? They don't necessarily know that it's bumblebees or honeybees or whatever, but people know that they're struggling. So pollination, what is it? Right, so that was one of the key points in the list I just showed you. And at the most basic level, and I'm sure most of you know this, pollination is the transfer of pollen grains containing the male sex cells of a plant from one flower to the female parts of the same or another flower, because you can get self-pollination with some flowers of the same species. So it's the reproductive bit for plants, basically. Pollination leads to fertilization when the pollen lands on the female parts of the flower, of the other flower. A few special magical things happen and within the receiving flower, and then we have the development of the seed and the fruit. And of course, you know, as conservationists, as farmers, as landowners, it's critical to everything we do and everything we're trying to preserve. So the picture on the right there shows a bumblebee carrying its pollen load and collecting pollen. And these are some of the commercial crops that are pollinated almost, well, not exclusively, but bumblebees have a huge part. Some of them are exclusively bumblebees, actually. Broad beans there, and peas and strawberries and raspberries, a whole range of our commercial crops. And Anna and I did have some discussion about a figure to give you of the commercial value to our agricultural systems. Anna, can you remind me what we said? Because I didn't put it in the slide because I don't think these things are ever quite accurate. But I
think the figure in 2015 was 690 million, but it will have increased by then. So,
and was that for the UK?
That was for the UK, for the year, for the UK.
Okay. And there's massive knock-on effects with that. So, for example, in Australia, they don't have native bumblebees, but they love their tomatoes. You know, you can imagine with all the barbecues and stuff down there. So they have to pollinate loads of their tomatoes by hand in their greenhouses because the government have banned them from importing bumblebees. So even though, you know, to the farmers, it would save so much money, because you imagine pollinating every single tomato with a small paintbrush or however they do it, you know. But where bumblebees have been imported in or taken into countries where they don't exist, they've played havoc with ecosystems. So in New Zealand, for example, when people from the UK emigrated over there a couple of 100 years ago, they took bumblebee queens with them because they wanted their native wildlife around them. And there are lots of bumblebees in New Zealand now, but oh my goodness, they have wreaked havoc with their native ecosystems. So, you know, massive implications. But the bottom line is, in the UK, as of the rest of the world, they have a huge economic value and importance in farming systems. So there are lots of different pollinators in the landscape. These are some of them. It isn't just down to bees. All of these creatures and their groups, their species groups, are pollinators to a greater or lesser extent. But bumblebees basically are really, really good at it. And there are several reasons for this. Like other bees, and unlike hoverflies and wasps, for example, bumblebees are totally reliant on pollen and nectar for food. So their flower visitation rates are really high compared to other pollinating insects, and they are unbelievably good at it because they're evolved to collect pollen, to drink nectar. I should have added earlier, the adults drink nectar to keep going for energy. But they will still inadvertently pick up pollen even if they are just supping nectar, which is why the males are pollinators as well as the females. Their fuzzy, lovely, cute bodies. I can't ever remember which way round it is, but it has a charge, an electric charge, which causes pollen to actually jump onto them. You know, they're so well evolved. So like I said, even though they might not be actively collecting pollen onto their corbicula, they are still attracting pollen and they're still transferring it from flower to flower. Bumblebees are quite cold adapted insects, as you would imagine, from their lovely furry bodies. They go right up to the Arctic. They're a species right up to the Arctic Circle. They don't exist in the tropics because they don't like the heat that much. And that means they can forage on days when, for example, hoverflies, solitary bees, butterflies are not on the wing because they need the sunshine more. Bumblebees don't. They can fly relatively long distances compared to smaller insects, like some of the smaller solitary bees and hoverflies, which means they can actually adapt to patchy resource within a landscape. They can, if we've got landowners and farmers creating patches of resource, these guys can utilize it within reason. So, and also they can be pollinating over distance as well. They have, well, I've put there the amazing scale of buzz pollination. I think there are some solitary bees that can do this as well, but basically bumblebees, I think in the UK, it's almost exclusively bumblebees, are the only ones that can pollinate certain plants. So tomatoes are one of them. I think kiwi fruits, possibly blueberries. There's a couple of others. And basically what they do, that the plants have adapted to hold on to their pollen really, really tightly to only release it onto bumblebees, basically onto the species that are going to be really effective in transferring it. So it's kind of really, really attached to the anthers, and the bumblebees will go in and they all disengage their wing muscles. They'll vibrate their wing muscles like really, really quickly, creating this really loud buzz. That's what creates the buzz, but they don't fly off because they've disengaged the wings from the muscles. But the buzz causes the pollen to puff off the anthers onto the bee's body. So it's a really, really highly evolved and clever method of pollination. And really, it's pretty much only bumblebees, with a few exceptions, that can do that. And I tell you, if you grow comfrey, you can watch them doing it. You can actually stand by a patch of comfrey and you'll see bumblebees going into the flower and buzzing it to get the pollen off. And tongue length. So I've brought this in. This is a slide I've pinched off a colleague, and it's quite an old slide now, and it's not that user friendly, but it does illustrate a point. So as I've said, there are other pollinators, and obviously, honeybees are important. I'm not anti-honeybee here, but just to put it into context, how important bumblebees are. As I said, we have one species of honeybee in the UK, and pretty much all of the workers have the same tongue lengths because they're morphologically pretty much identical, and it's around about 6 millimeters long. So in terms of the flowers they can visit, they are limited in collecting nectar to drink, and consequently their effectiveness as pollinators by that relatively short tongue. And so the range of plants they visit is represented by this circle here. Very, very scientific, as you can see. Bumblebees, we have 24 species, and they vary massively in size and consequently massively in tongue lengths. So our smallest bumbles, for example, early bumblebee workers, have really short tongues, comparable with a honeybee. And then we have everything in between in terms of length, up to the garden bumblebee, where the queens, their tongues can reach nearly 2 centimeters. Okay, so the range of plants that bumblebees can pollinate is much, much larger, and it encompasses pretty much all of the ones that the honeybees will go for as well. So they are incredibly effective in maintaining what we see in our landscape in terms of wildflowers, but also in crop pollination as well. And you know what, Anna, I'm so sorry we talked about this earlier, and I've realised I've forgotten to put a slide in, which is really important, but I can tell you about it. And it's pretty much the most important one of all. I'm so sorry, but it's about bumblebee decline. And before I do the last bit on the bumblebee year, actually, I'll do the bumblebee year first, and then I'll just tell you a tiny little bit about decline. So the bumblebee year just for you to have an idea what's happening in your landscape and what you're seeing, we've got a lovely little image of illustration of a year in the life of Bumblebee. So at this time of year, exactly now, we are beginning to see queens emerge from hibernation, and they will have mated the season before. So they're ready to go. They store the sperm. Once they've mated, the male dies, and she's able to store the sperm and use it when she needs it. So she's completely self-sufficient. And the first thing she needs to do is feed. So spring forage for emerging queen bumbles is critical. And here we've got illustrated willow catkins, which are brilliant. If you've got a corner or a hedgerow with willow in, which has got catkins, brilliant for bumblebees. She feeds up and she selects a nest site. So that's what some of them are just beginning to do now. Their nesting site depends on species. And once she's fed and she's created her nest, often underground, hedgerows really important for nesting bumblebees, base of hedgerows, that sort of habitat. She will collect pollen and nectar, and you can see she's sitting on this little ball here, and that's a ball of pollen and nectar in which she lays her first batch of eggs. And this is one of my favourite things about bumblebees. One, she will sit on her eggs like a bird, so she broods them and keeps them warm, which is amazing for an insect. And also she will make a little cup out of wax from her body, actually make a cup that actually sits in front of her, and she fills it with nectar so that she can drink out of it while she's brooding her eggs, which I think is crazy. You know, it's amazing. So she's brilliant, and she gets everything started. And she'll need to forage during this time. She's got to keep herself going. And she may eat pollen as well to keep herself going and drink lots of nectar. So she needs ongoing resources through the spring. And then as the spring and summer progress, her eggs will hatch, and she has different sort of little cohorts. So she'll lay a batch, and the first batch will turn into grubs, and then they will pupate into adult females, which are her daughters, and they will behave as workers. And they will then go out collecting pollen for the colony. They will tend their younger sisters as they are, you know, the eggs are laid and the grubs are hatched, etc. And they will take on all of the work, building new wax cells, etc., etc. And the nest grows and grows and grows through the summer. And so that's why we see lots and lots of bumblebees in our gardens and in our meadows through the summer months. And then towards the end of the nest cycle, which varies from species to species in terms of timing, the queen will do all sorts of clever things, and her hormones and dictate how she behaves. And she will start at the end of her colony life cycle to lay eggs which turn into males and queens, new daughter queens. The males go off, they never come back to the nest, they sleep outside, and they basically, the stories around how males look for queens is actually fascinating, beyond the scope of today. But they will do mating sort of flights looking for queens of the same species. And the queens that are produced from that nest may go back for shelter and food, but ultimately what they need to do is mate with a male from another nest. And once she's done that, she's ready to hibernate. So once that queen is mated, she's off, she's feeding up and looking for a hibernation spot to survive the winter. And hopefully, with a bit of luck, she will survive and emerge the following spring, and all of the old colony will die. Okay, so that's the bumblebee year, and that for next week, that will give you an idea of that helps with identification, and also it helps with conserving bumblebees on your land, because I know Anna and Stuart will pick up on this, on requiring food and forage and nesting and hibernation sites for bumblebees throughout, throughout the year for the food, and nesting and hibernation sites are also important. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm just going to quickly say about decline. So I'm so sorry about forgetting that slide, but basically just to tell you what was on the slide. Bumblebees have declined massively since the end of World War II in the UK, across Northern Europe and North America, and wherever they exist in the world. For us, it's the biggest driving factor is loss of habitat. There are many factors, but loss of habitat has been the biggest thing, and changes in methods of food production. So, the loss of species-rich grasslands has really driven that decline. But even in the time I've been working on them, I think there's a change afoot, and there are loads of positive things happening to reverse that decline and to provide forage for these insects. So, the future isn't perhaps so bleak for them as it might have been, and hopefully, they can adapt to the changes a lot of us are making. So I will stop there and hand over to Anna and Stuart. Thank you very much.
Right. Claire, are you able to share my presentation? I think my internet's maybe glitching a bit, so I might have to turn my camera off, but I'll see how it goes.
Okay, bear with me a sec then, Anna.
Thank you.
So, can you see that okay, Anna?
Yeah, lovely, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine. Just tell me when to flick the slides.
Thank you. If I do sort of come and go, if you can let me know, because you were sort of freezing a bit, so but hopefully it'll behave. Noswaith da pawb. Thanks ever so much for joining us tonight. It's really nice to see you all. I'm Anna Hobbs, as Rhys said, and I work for Bumblebee Conservation Trust as a conservation officer in Wales. And I'm going to start talking just briefly about the Gacwn Gwenyn project that we're working on with the Gacwn Wen Dairy Cooperative. And then Stuart, one of the Gacwn Wen farmers, is going to talk about his experience farming for bumblebees and other pollinators. Okay, thanks, Claire. So firstly, Gacwn Gwenyn, which I hope you can see it on my slide. Something funny has happened on the top of my screen. But so Gacwn Gwenyn is a 3-year Wales-wide project with Gacwn Wen farmers leading the way. We started last May, so it runs until the end of 2023. And we're basically helping farmers to identify what they can do to enhance their farms for pollinators, for bumblebees and other pollinators as well. So we go out and we survey the farm, we look at which habitats are there, the species that are present on the farms, and then we come up with suggestions of how they can enhance those habitats for bumblebees and other pollinators, and discuss that with the farmers, and then produce a report and a map for them. We've also been very fortunate this year, the last financial year, to receive support from BioNet, which is the nature partnership for the northeast of Wales. And that's enabled us to work with one of the Flintshire Council tenant farmers and some of the nature-friendly farming network farmers as well in the northeast of Wales, which has been great. So By the end of the project, we're hoping that all of the farmers we're working with, including all of the Gacwn Wen farmers, will be working towards enhancing their farms for bumblebees and other pollinators. And in addition to that, we're looking to identify cluster areas around some of the Gacwn Wen farms where we hope that we could continue work in the future and look at working at a landscape scale for pollinator conservation, which would take things to a whole new level to work at that scale. It would be absolutely fantastic. Okay, thanks, Claire. Right, so we're looking at each farm as a whole. So when we go out and survey, we look at the whole farm. We're looking at both semi-natural habitats like woodland edges and hedgerows, and also the farmed area. And as Claire mentioned, bumblebees need this continuous source of forage, so flower-rich areas across a farm, right from February, March time when the new queens emerge. Oh, right, sorry, Gacwn Wen farms. So Gacwn Wen is a dairy cooperative in Wales. So I think, Stuart, am I right, at the 22, 25 farms at the moment?
Yes, about 25. It's organic milk from Wales, and there's about 25 farms in.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, so the queens emerged in February, March time from hibernation, and they obviously need this continuous forage, so a continuous supply of flowers right from that point the whole way through while the colony is going to when the new queens that are produced that year after they've mated, they go into hibernation around September, October time and hibernate for the winter initial starts again. So we need this continuous supply of flower-rich areas as well as habitat for them to nest and hibernate in. And we need these areas to be spread out across the farm so that the bumblebees are able to fly the distances to find food. But because we're looking at all pollinators in this project, not just bumblebees, the smallest pollinator needs to be able to fly the distance required in order to find food as well. So it's better to spread it out. And often there are gaps in this food source within the season. So for example, if you're cutting silage on your farm, it may go from feast, having lots of flowers around. If it's cut in all one go, it can go to famine for these pollinators. So it's trying to look at ways where we can maintain that supply of forage as well as the other habitat that they need. And these pictures show some of the habitats that are on some of the farms we've been working with. And I was just going to run through a few of the things that, a few of the management options that farmers have been undertaking. So we may be looking at restoring habitats or enhancing them, or maybe managing them, creating habitats and managing them better for pollinators. Some of the individual farmers are delaying grazing on some of their grassland if they've got unimproved or semi-improved grassland. If they delay grazing or cutting on that grassland, then it can increase the amount of flowers for the next year, allow them to set seed and increase the amount of flowers in the sward. And it can also extend the flowering period, the period when the flowers are available for the pollinators to feed on. We're also, some farmers have planted at wildflower areas, reinstated hedgerows, planted orchards, and some are at the moment are just finishing off planting trees and shrubs, either within the hedgerows or in various locations around the farm to provide spring forage. Quite often there's a lack of spring forage on some of the farms, so that's really important. And then we've just looked at general management of other habitats like ditch management and managing track sides to increase the amount of flowers there, or to ensure that there's tussocky grass around. Claire mentioned that where bumblebees might nest in hedgerow bases, in maybe old mammal holes, in tussocky grass that hasn't been managed for a few years. And then we've also looked at planting herbal lays, or if not planting full herbal lays, some of the farmers are introducing herbs into a standard mixture of rye and clover, so introducing some more species in to give a bit more diversity. And if cutting silage occurs before or just as the flowers are coming into flower, then we've been looking at leaving uncut margins in some of the silage fields around the farms. So I think that's about me, and I'm going to hand over to Stuart now. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm Stuart Taylor. I farm 150 acres just outside Mould. I keep 65 British Friesian cows. We've been organic since 2000, but the journey in this direction really started much earlier than that, when quotas were introduced, and that's when we moved away from nitrogen fertiliser. I've done quite a bit of habitat creation over the years with replanted hedges and some small areas of trees. But now I'm interested in making the whole farm wildlife friendly by improving grassland management in a way that enhances the value of the grass for cows and pollinators. Can we have the next slide, please? So that's a picture of our typical grassland, ryegrass and clover aimed for the milking herd, really. We can, almost all the fields, we can alternate between silage and grazing, so every field gets silaged or grazed a couple of times during the year. Next slide, please. This is a sandy, banky hill, which we rented for years, and then I managed to buy it in 2015. And then since then, I've gone on to rotational grazing, which is the cows have paddock for 24 hours, and then the next day they have a new paddock and they're off the first paddock. Now this field, it's the one field I can't really silage because it's very steep. It's a sort of circular bank and it's very sandy and gravelly. Anyway, as a sort of byproduct of the rotational grazing, I've realised rotational grazing is not only good for the cows, it's really good for the flowers, because we used to set stock this field, which we just turn the cows in the spring and have the whole field all summer, and they just wander around eating all the best bits and nothing ever got a chance to flower. Whereas now it can take 60 days to get right round and back to the first paddock. So each paddock has 60 days rest, which is ample time for the flowers to flower and set seed. And this is the result. It's much more flowery than it used to be. It's also really easy if there's some special bit that I'd like to encourage to set seed. It's very easy to skip a whole paddock or half a paddock. And also parasol mushrooms have appeared over the past 5 years. Flowers are yarrow. The yellow one is mouse ear hawkweed. They're the two main ones. There's also a little bit of black medic. Now looking at that, a typical dairy farmer might think cows won't really like that, but they do, they love it. As you can see behind the cows in the picture on the bottom right, they graze it all off till it's green, and then of course the next day they have a fresh paddock and it all starts all over again. Next slide please. This is my main hay field. It hasn't been ploughed for over 100 years and there's still ridges and means in it from the old style ploughing before reversible ploughs. Now having said that, it wasn't all that special through the years of using nitrogen and even then just slurry until I started cutting in July to let it flower and set seed. There used to be only a few scattered red clover plants, but now there's more or less a continuous understory of red clover right through, which is good for the pollinators, but also you know, red clover is a really good food for cows. And something I've realised is these older lays, they're actually more useful than modern farming has taught us. So it's really good food for dry cows. It's fibrous and not too nutritious, and it makes really easily into hay. I sometimes make hay in 3 days if I have to, because it's not as juicy as ryegrass. And I have experimented with chopping it for bedding as well, which allows me to produce my own bedding without having to grow corn. Another plant that's appeared on this management is the occasional orchid. Next slide please. So then dairy cows have got a very high nutritional requirement. So yes, it does work as bedding, but it must be chopped. It doesn't do to use it as unchopped. It has to be chopped. So a way to give the milkers a more nutritional diet is through legumes, which are good for cows and pollinators, and of course put nitrogen into the soil, which is very important for us being organic. So this is a picture, the top right is a picture of our organic herbal lay. That's got 16 different species in, as against 5 or 6 for a standard agricultural lay. They won't all make it, but so that you put a wide range of seeds in, and the ones that are suited to our conditions are the ones that will thrive. They also so many different plants flower over a longer window, and they root at different depths, so whatever sort of season it is, something will probably do well. Next slide please. So there's no point growing these lays from the pollinator's point of view unless they're allowed to flower. So one technique is to, if you're silaging before they've flowered or finished flowering, we leave an uncut strip, and you can see in this picture we've silaged either side and then left this strip to flower. and then the next time we will harvest this strip, and perhaps we'll leave that strip on the right to flower. So you're not losing it, you're just offsetting when you get it. And being legumes, the quality doesn't fall all that much. And it's also, dairy cows do need fibre. So it also adds to that. So we've got like a mosaic. We're alternating between grazing and silaging, and we're leaving these uncut strips and alternating where in the field they are. So the end result is, as I said, a mosaic of all sorts of different stages of growth in different areas, and hopefully all flowering in succession, so that when we do silage, it's not totally bare fields everywhere. Next strip. Next slide, please. This is our sort of general lay. Ryegrass and generally white clover and little bits of red clover do come in. I've got a program of going round enriching these with by overseeding the herbal lays. It's not quite as effective as ploughing and reseeding, but it's easier. The field is out of action for less time, and it's more weather resilient because I don't want to plough and make a seed bed and sow, and now that we have these heavy rain episodes on my slopes, it might wash the seed bed away and have to start all over again. If you do try overseeding, I realised you shouldn't judge it, you shouldn't look at it for a year, because they don't all come at once. The seeds will carry on germinating over 2 or 3 years, so don't judge it until the second year. Mind you, I find it really hard not to go and look after about 6 weeks. Next slide, please. So as well as the farmed areas, I've got this network of permanent habitat over the farm, and this is also a buffer against farming operations because it gives the wildlife somewhere to go. The main picture is the main drive up to the farm, and this shows that Woodland Edge. Edges are really important, so it starts off at ground level with flowering plants, a lot of umbelliferous there, and then it goes on to small flowering trees like rowan and hazel, and then you get up to the full-size forest trees. And then it's the same thing on the right with flowering plants at ground level. The hedges are cut every 2 to 3 years, and then there's some hedgerow trees. And I really appreciate the hedgerow trees with the weather we have nowadays. I arrange all my electric fences in order to make sure the cows have either got a tree either for shade when it's too sunny or for shelter in wind and rain. Next slide, please. The trick is not to be too tidy. That's my excuse anyway. So it's good to have some areas that are a little bit wild. The picture on the left is a trackway, and sometimes it will be muddy because we've had to take cows along in wet weather, and then sometimes it's like this, a little bit overgrown but very good for wildlife. The same with the other photo. And next slide, please. So there's some more uncut ground on the top left. Bottom left is the Bumblebee Nest. Something that intrigues me is all around the farm there'll just be little bits of dry stone wall for no apparent reason. Anyway, it's got good crevices in for bees, and various sorts of plants getting established in them. And then the bottom right is bare soil, which is good for solitary mining bees. And one thing cows are good at is creating bare soil in copse. They love to rub their heads. You sometimes see them, you'll see one cow with a completely muddy face, like she's got a mud pack on. So that's something that cows do for pollinators as well. And next slide, please. We've got 3 ponds and 2 streams, and in various ways they're important for insect life. And that's about it from me. Oh, one more slide. This is me and my friend on bee identification day outside Wrexham that the Bumblebee Conservation Trust ran. That was great fun. Okay, that's me. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Claire, Stuart, and Anna. It was really, really fascinating and interesting stuff. I think, Claire, your presentation really kind of, for me anyway, brought home the sort of importance of pollinators, and you kind of, as you mentioned, really they sort of underpin our food system, really, don't they? So, you know, as farmers, they're of vital importance. And I just did a bit of fact checking, and you're right that the value, or the economic value of pollinating sort of services in the UK is around 690 million each year, and globally it's around 120 billion pounds. So yeah, you can't kind of underestimate their importance, really. And I thought the tongue length slide was really fascinating as well. I honestly, I wasn't aware that bumblebee factories existed as well. So thank you so much, Claire. And Anna and Stuart, I think kind of it really showed, you know, a great overview of what kind of farmers can do for pollinators. You know, so Claire mentioned some of the declines associated with kind of intensification of farming, but you know, there's a lot of good stuff that's going on out there that needs to be talked about. And Stuart, I can say, like, you're doing some great stuff at Arcoed, which is great to see, and echo what kind of Michael and others said in the chat. The place looks amazing, looks like a paradise for pollinators. But I'll just mention quickly, kind of looking at the wider picture in Wales. I think sort of recording and monitoring pollinators, or any wildlife really for that matter, it's going to become more and more important in the years to come, I think, particularly so in the context of new agricultural schemes and payments in Wales. Now that we've sort of left the common agricultural policy under the European Union, we've got a clean slate, really, in all sense of purposes, to design a new farming policy support system in Wales. And we're expecting the Welsh Government to launch its sustainable farming scheme. So that's the proposed scheme that will eventually replace the basic payment scheme and the associated environment schemes in Wales. We're expecting that to be launched around 2025, and expecting a first draft of that scheme this summer. And if you've read previous Welsh Government consultations on sort of the future of agricultural policies, the new scheme will be more focused on sort of paying farmers to deliver benefits, so things like carbon sequestration, habitat management, things like improving air and water quality as well, soil health, reducing flood risk, just to name a few things. And the NFFN working hard to call on the Welsh Government to facilitate really and reward farmers to deliver food production side by side with thriving environmental wildlife. So similar to what Stuart is doing at Gacwn. And if we can get it right, then we can create more habitat and kind of manage our habitat better. So like Anna and Stuart mentioned, create more sort of species-rich grasslands, create and manage our hedgerows more appropriately, create more pollinator strips and field margins, and this can make a huge difference for our pollinating species. And if there's a payment to help farmers work together on that sort of landscape scale, then I think that would be amazing as well. And the government has hinted as well as having to take sort of sustainable farm reviews to inform management options under the new scheme. So this would entail undertaking an assessment of what sort of currently exists on the farm in terms of habitats and wildlife. So it's going to be really important for us as farmers, I think, to know kind of what we have on our farms. And after all, we can't manage what we don't measure. And there's been suggestions that there'll be more focus on farmers sort of undertaking self-monitoring to demonstrate how our actions deliver environmental benefits. So an increased knowledge of species identification is likely to make this process much smoother. So, you know, Claire's session next week, I think will be a big benefit from that. And I also mentioned, always mention this, for me, I think developing a better understanding of what wildlife we have on the farm certainly makes me more engaged how our farming land use methods biodiversity. And it really brings to light, I think, that relationship between farming and wildlife. I think it adds another dimension to your day as well, doesn't it? I'm sure Stuart, you'll agree, kind of going around the farm in summer and kind of taking all that sort of wildlife in, the smells, the sound, and the imagery. You know, it's a pleasure, isn't it, to witness. And you know, it's great from a mental health point of view as well. And for me, it makes me realise that we're part of something bigger. You know, as farmers, we are food producers, but I think the role of farmers in general, it's evolving. You know, we're also sort of land managers and kind of custodians of the landscape. You know, and there's so much things that we can do as farmers born into them. And I think we should embrace that, you know, and be proud of it. Showcase it to the world, really. So that's enough from me. Some questions. Sorry if I'm missed anything in the chat. Let's look now. Question from Michael up in Scotland. Does the Bumblebee Conservation Trust have anything similar in with Scottish farmers? Is there anything of relevance up north? I don't know whether Claire or Anna wants to answer that question.
Yeah, I can answer that bit, but one of our managers is actually online. I've spotted her, but she's trying to look inconspicuous. Our trust conservation manager is actually in the audience, so I'm going to ask her up on stage because she is best qualified to answer. So introducing Sinead Lynch, who is conservation manager for Bumblebee Conservation across the UK. Sinead, do you want to go for that one?
Sure, thank you. Sorry, I just came along for my own pleasure to watch watch Stuart and Anna and Claire talking. But yeah, I did directly message Michael as well, just in case we didn't get around to the question, but we don't have a similar project as we do in Wales in terms of the current work we're doing with Gacwn Wen. But we do work with farmers in areas where we've got great yellow bumblebee, so that's kind of Orkney, Caithness, Sutherland, Outer Hebs, Inner Hebs. So we kind of are doing some work with sort of farmers and crofters. And in terms of I mean, there's an identical project to Claire's up in the Cairngorms. So that's all about monitoring, recording and monitoring bumblebees. But yeah, if you've got ideas for projects, I'm sure we would be all ears, and I've dropped my email into the chat, so do get in touch if you've got thoughts on that.
I've got a question for Stuart, really. I think your kind of slides really show that sort of nature-friendly farming, you know, it's better for wildlife, nature environments. But from what you were saying, it also looks like, you know, it benefits animal health and the sort of farm business as well, the economics of it all. So yeah, just wanted to gather your thoughts on that too, because I guess some might kind of view that farming, kind of nature-friendly farming, as sort of a bit wishy-washy and not proper farming. But you know, kind of with prices of fertilizer now kind of £700 a tonne, etc. I would imagine that your way of farming is actually kind of more economically resilient than, you know, the sort of high input, high output approach. So yeah, just whether you've got any reflections on that.
Yes, it's more resilient. I haven't known what the price of fertilizer is for about 25 years, and I'm completely not bothered. Apparently 2 fertilizer plants closed in the UK last year, and this was supposed to be a terrible threat to our agriculture, and once again I really wasn't bothered. Excuse me. So yeah, it makes us less reliant on oil. I'm convinced that it's better, that it's the way to go. I couldn't do it if I wasn't organic. I do need a better price for the milk. So I couldn't do it on a low milk price, no. But I would say, yes, it's far more resilient to weather, to economics.
And yeah, I guess that sort of resisting drought during the summer and better the soil on the ground's capacity to infiltrate and kind of store water as well, kind of during high rainfall as well, is a benefit, I would imagine.
Yes, a slightly longer grass buffers the rain, and the hedges with their margins do as well. And animal health is better. A lot of the things I was taught in college would be a problem, just no problem. They just concentrate on health of the cows and the fields, and everything sorts itself out most of the time.
We've got a question from Lucy. Is it more challenging to create bumblebee-friendly habitats in an arable situation? Don't know whether you've got whether Anna, in your experience of working with Gacwn Wen farmers and different farming methods, whether farm type has any bearing on sort of pollinator success.
I mean, what we've been doing is very much looking at each individual farm and trying to find options that fit within that sustainable, productive farming system. So tailoring the options, and we found that not every option we've looked at is for everyone by any means, but there are always options that can be available. And obviously we're not as arable and so we've been looking at more grassland sort of situations, but there are definitely things that we've looked at that would be appropriate for any farming system. Some of the things, as Stuart sort of mentioned, are easier maybe to achieve when you're on an organic farm compared to a conventional farm. But again, I think there's always something that, or different options that you can look at. And yeah, I mean, if you wanted to email separately, I'd be more than happy to discuss it. And we don't have a huge capacity to work with everyone, but we are hoping that in the future we'll have a project officer in North Wales and be able to look at a, you know, as I was saying, a larger sort of landscape area, because that's the direction that we need to be working at, the level that we need to be working at to try and conserve pollinators in the wider countryside. Yeah.
Brilliant, thanks Anna. I'm aware we've gone over time slightly. Are there any other questions? I can't see anything in the chat, but just wondering if anyone wants to ask a final question before we call it a night. I will take that silence to mean a no then. So thank you very much, everyone, for speaking. It's been really fascinating. I've learned a lot. And just a reminder, again, there's a follow-up session next Wednesday, the 9th of March, 6 o'clock, where we'll take a bit more in-depth look at Bumblebee ID and sort of how to monitor and record them on the farm. So diolch yn fawr iawn bawb am ddod a nos da.